Hi, this is Dave from Motels, and I'm here to build on Pete Dahl's recent talk about axles. My story here is actually Al Bosley's story. The axle is surprisingly one of the items on a car which requires the longest lead to set up tooling. So the Valiant axle was planned before the details of the engine or transmission were known. In early 1957, in fact, Al was responsible for the rear axle, the drivetrain, and the rear suspension, even though he was still a pretty young engineer new to the company. The front and rear suspension designs were then at different departments at Chrysler. This is kind of an odd idea since they really do have to work together. Evan Jones was the manager of the Axle Lab, and he had a great deal of experience, so he would sketch the axle out and write down the specifications, and then the drafting department would convert them into drawings for manufacturing and purchasing. Evan started working on this axle with Al Bosley at the start of 1957. They talked a lot about what would be needed, but they didn't have a whole lot of information about the car that the axle was being designed for. The length of the pinion, the vehicle track, the amount of power or the amount of weight. They only knew that it would be a light, small car. Al said that Evan had talked with the people who actually made the axles down in Lynch Road, and they were not happy with the Hotchkiss axles used at the time. And they concluded that the 7¼ inch axle using a carrier tube was the way to go because it provided more flexibility on tread. It was more rigid, and it avoided manufacturing issues. The axles that Chrysler traditionally used were a two-piece drive axle arrangement with tapered outer end shafts that fit into a separate flange and had a nut and a key that held it together. And they were very hard to get apart if you needed to get to the brakes or change axle shafts. It was Al Bosley who proposed using a flanged shaft like GM and Ford. Now, at Chrysler, since the very first Chrysler in 1924, they always used straight axles with a taper and a bolt-on flange, instead of using a hot upset process where the end of a bar is heated and then forged back on itself to create a larger flange. And the people at the axle plant said that it would be a little more expensive, but they could still do it, and it would be better overall for the car. The drawings were released in mid-1958 to the Lynch Road axle plant and to the purchasing, and they just started designing the tooling. They ordered the gear cutting machines, got the casting patterns done, and did everything else they needed. Now, Al Bosley said that there were two things that he wishes that they had done better. And the first thing is that neither of them ever thought anyone would run 300 brake horsepower through that axle. That's around 240 horsepower as we talk about it now. And the differential gears in the pin were really too small. On the lighter side, the short grip
Section is
versions did
removable with
hold up
defaults
better.
here. You
And
can
the other
revoke
thing
this,
that he
take
wishes
the
he
whole
had done
center section,
differently
take the gears
was
out.
something
So
that
in
they
that
did
case,
to
it's
save
very
weight.
similar
So in the
to
8
the
and 3
Ford
quarter
Valiant.
inch axle
Now,
that
where do
Pete
we get
Dahl
8
talked
3/4
about
or
a couple of days ago, the main drive gear pumps oil up to the front bearing along a passageway in the top of the axle casting. There is a little void along the bottom of the rear bearing so that the oil can get back again. And they left that out on the 7¼ inch axle that was used on the original Valiant. It turns out that both bearings didn't get enough lubrication, so the axle ran a little hot. Al Bosley later said, perhaps if we had realized that someday we would want to put a 346 pack engine in front of it, we might have thought about it a little bit longer. In any case, most of these things got changed later, and he said that he thought that the weight and cost savings for the first 3 or 4 years was a good decision. Now, you might be wondering about the small 5-bolt circle that's at the end of this axle at either end for the wheels to go on. By the time that was set up, Al Bosley had joined the Valiant task force. They made a choice to use a smaller bolt circle to make the axle shaft easier to process, to make the upset process easier to create that flange, and to save weight. So the Valiant has a smaller bolt circle than the Chevy or Ford did, but with 5 wheel bolts instead of 4. The Falcon and the Chevrolet had 4 wheel bolts on a larger circle. The wheel maker said that that would be okay, so they were able to cut the diameter on the flanged axle shaft. I would like to thank Al Bosley for providing this information, and he really did provide me with a good amount of material which I still haven't finished going through and presenting to you yet, but hopefully I'll have more for you at some point soon. I would like to thank Al Bosley, who passed this story on to me when he was in his 90s, and Peter Dahl, who did the recent Mopar axle presentation.